You know, there's something about the final moments of life that brings out the truth in people. When someone knows they're about to leave this world, they often feel the need to get things off their chest, especially the things they've been hiding for years, sometimes decades. That's when the masks come off, secrets come out. And what's said in those last breaths can be shocking, haunting, and sometimes downright chilling. Today, we're diving into a side of life and death that most people never get to see. We're talking about nurses, the ones who are right there when someone is taking their last breath. Over the years, many nurses have heard things you wouldn't believe. Stories, confessions, things people have held in for a lifetime and only let go of right before the end. Some of these deathbed confessions are heartbreaking. Others are strange. And a few, they're terrifying. In this video, I'm going to share with you 10 of the most spine-chilling deathbed confessions ever heard by nurses. And I promise you, these are not just stories. These are real accounts. And by the end of this video, you'll probably be thinking twice about the people around you and the secrets they might be carrying. So sit tight, keep watching, and don't forget to let me know in the comments what you would do if you heard one of these confessions. Let's get into it. Number 1. The hidden crime, a murder buried in time. The confession came late one night in a quiet rural hospice. The patient, a frail man in his late 80s named Thomas B., had been unresponsive for most of the day. As the nurse on duty, Megan Carter, a hospice worker with over 20 years of experience, checked his vitals, he suddenly grabbed her wrist, eyes wide open, as if shaken awake by the weight of something unbearable. "I need to tell someone," he whispered, "before I go." Megan leaned in, expecting a personal story, maybe something sweet or emotional about his family. But what Thomas said next left her frozen. "I killed a man. A long time ago, my neighbor. Everyone thought it was an accident, but it wasn't. It was me. I meant to do it." He spoke slowly, each word laced with regret and fear. He said it happened in the summer of 1951, when he was just 17, in a small town in Kentucky. His neighbor, Daniel R., was 21, older, stronger, and known around town as a troublemaker. According to Thomas, Daniel had been harassing his younger sister for weeks. One afternoon, after overhearing another disturbing exchange between them, Thomas confronted him near the river that ran behind their homes. "We got into a fight," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I picked up a rock and hit him. He fell into the water. I didn't try to save him. I just watched." Daniel's body was found days later. The police concluded he must have slipped and hit his head. There were no witnesses. Thomas never told a soul, not his parents, not his friends, not even his wife of 40 years. He carried that secret for over 70 years. "I thought I was doing the right thing at the time," he told Megan, tears streaming down his cheeks. "But not a day passed I didn't see his face in my dreams." The next morning, Thomas passed away peacefully. Megan later said she could feel a shift in the room after his confession, as though something dark and heavy had been released. She never reported the story to the authorities. The man was gone, the crime unsolved, and the era it happened in long buried. But the confession haunted her for years. "Some people are afraid of dying," she said in an interview years later, "but others are more afraid of what they've done while alive, and who they'll have to face on the other side." Number 2. The lost child. In a quiet corner of a hospice facility in rural Ohio, a woman named Margaret, 87 years old and frail from advanced heart failure, called her nurse over late one evening. The air was still, the lights dim, and her voice was barely louder than a whisper. The nurse, Amanda Reynolds, leaned in gently. Margaret's eyes welled with tears as she spoke. "I need to get something off my chest," she said, "before I go." What she revealed next had been buried in her soul for nearly 7 decades. At just 19 years old, in 1953, Margaret had fallen in love with a boy from the next town over. They met at church socials, shared milkshakes at the corner diner, and wrote each other's secret letters. When she became pregnant, her world collapsed. Her parents were strict, devout Catholics, and the shame of an unwed pregnancy in the 1950s was more than they could bear. Without telling a soul beyond her mother, Margaret was quietly sent away to a home for unwed mothers in another state. A harsh, cold place run by nuns where girls were hidden away from society until their babies were born. There were no warm smiles there, no kindness, just shame, secrecy, and silence. I gave birth alone, in a sterile room with no one to hold my hand, she recalled through tears. They didn't let me see his face. They took him right away. I didn't even get to hold him. They said it was for the best, that he'd go to a family who could give him everything I couldn't. She never told her husband, never told her children, never spoke the name of the boy she loved. It became a locked memory, pushed to the deepest part of her heart. But now, on the edge of her final breath, that lock had come undone. I never stopped thinking of him. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I saw a little boy playing in a park, I wondered, was that him? Is he happy? Did he know he was loved? She didn't want forgiveness. She didn't even ask for it. She just wanted her truth to be known, if only by a single stranger, before she passed. Nurse Amanda held her hand and wept with her. After Margaret died later that night, Amanda contacted a social worker and passed on the details in hopes that perhaps one day the lost child, now an elderly man himself, might find out that his mother never forgot him. It's said that the last thing Margaret whispered before she slipped away was, "I'm sorry, my baby. I loved you." Number 3. The hidden identity. The man with two lives. Nurse Rebecca Carson had been working in palliative care for over a decade when she met Mr. L. A quiet, polite man in his late 70s with a soft European accent. He was dying of pancreatic cancer and didn't have much time left. He had 2 grown children who visited often, a loving wife, and lived what appeared to be a normal, peaceful life in a small American town. But on the 3rd night of his stay, when Rebecca came in to check on him during a quiet overnight shift, Mr. L looked at her and said, "Can I tell you something? It won't leave this room, will it?" She reassured him, and what he told her would haunt her forever. His real name wasn't the one on his medical file. Not even close. He was born in Yugoslavia during a time of intense political violence in the 1950s. As a young man, he got caught up with a radical resistance group, not because he believed in their politics, but because his best friend did. That best friend ended up dead during a failed uprising, and Mr. L was accused of playing a role in it. He said he was innocent, but in those days, guilt was decided before the trial. Fearing for his life, he paid a fisherman to smuggle him across the Adriatic Sea into Italy. From there, with forged documents and a new name, he made his way to Canada, and eventually the US. He completely erased his past, changed his name, his birth date, even his religion. He married, had kids, opened a business. His wife had no idea. Neither did his children. Rebecca asked him why he never told them. He said, "If I told them who I really was, they would never look at me the same. I didn't do the things they said I did, but I ran." And that part was true. I ran and I never looked back. He pulled out a small box from his bag. It contained old, yellowed photos, letters in Serbo-Croatian, and a ring he said belonged to his real father. He hadn't looked at the contents in over 40 years. In his final days, he asked Rebecca to burn the box after he passed, and to make sure it never got to his family. He wanted them to remember him as the man they knew, not the fugitive he used to be. She honored his wish. The box was never seen again. Mr. L died 2 days later with his wife and children by his side, none of them ever knowing the full truth. To this day, Rebecca says she often wonders what would have happened if someone had discovered his past while he was still alive, or if somewhere someone from that old world was still looking for him. Number 4. The Secret Affair. A lifetime of lies. Nurse Carla Summers had seen countless patients come and go in her 15 years of working in hospice care, but few had stories as shocking and heart-wrenching as Mrs. Geraldine "Jerry" Harris. Mrs. Harris was in her early 80s, a refined woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, who had been married to her husband, George, for over 50 years. The couple had always been seen as the epitome of a loving marriage. George, a successful local businessman, and Jerry, a beloved volunteer and community figure. They had 2 children, a beautiful home, and a picture-perfect life. But as Jerry lay dying from advanced heart failure, a confession began to spill from her lips, forever changing Carla's view of the family she had come to know. It was a quiet evening shift when Jerry suddenly took Carla's hand and whispered, "Can I tell you something? I've kept this secret for far too long." Carla, already familiar with the heavy burden of secrets patients often carried in their final days, nodded and assured her that whatever it was, it would stay between them. What Jerry revealed would stay with Carla for the rest of her life. In a trembling voice, Jerry confessed that for nearly 20 years she had been having an affair with Mark, her husband's best friend. Mark was a charismatic, outgoing man who had been George's closest companion for decades. Carla was shocked. How could someone so seemingly perfect be hiding such a devastating truth? Jerry described the affair in painful detail, recounting the first time they'd crossed the line during a weekend getaway when George had been away on a business trip. She said it started out as something innocent, a lingering glance here, an unexpected touch there, but soon spiraled into a passionate, guilt-laden relationship that lasted for 2 decades. The affair continued even after George's health began to decline, with Gary feeling more and more trapped in a lie that she couldn't undo. The most heart-wrenching part of the confession was when Jerry admitted that George had never known. He had always trusted Mark, believing him to be like a brother. She wept as she said, "I should have told him, but I was too scared to lose everything. My family, my life, the security. And I didn't want to hurt him. He was already sick, and I just couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth." As Gary spoke, Carla could hear the deep remorse and sorrow in her voice. The weight of the secret had been bearing down on her for years, but now, in her final days, it seemed unbearable. "I need forgiveness," Jerry whispered. "I hope wherever George is, he can forgive me. I hope the truth doesn't haunt me forever." Carla didn't know what to say. She could feel the pain and regret in every word, but all she could offer was a quiet assurance that Jerry would find peace soon. She promised that no one would hear of this confession, and Jerry seemed to find a little solace in knowing that the burden would not be carried by her children or anyone else. But the true weight of the affair, and the unresolved guilt that had haunted Gary for so long, seemed to lift slightly after she told her story. She passed away 2 days later, peacefully in her sleep, with the guilt of her secret finally spoken, though never shared with the family that would mourn her loss. Carla, however, would never forget the confession. Years later, she still wonders whether Jerry truly found the peace she had so desperately hoped for, or whether the truth of the affair will haunt her in the afterlife, just as it had for so many years on Earth. Number 5. The Unspoken Love. A lifetime of silence. Nurse Lena Walker had seen many patients pass away during her career, but Richard Matthews was different. Richard was a reserved man in his late 60s, tall and with a somber expression that rarely revealed much. He had lived a quiet, solitary life in a small town and had always been known as someone who kept to himself. He wasn't married, had no children, and didn't seem to have any family around to visit him in his final days. Yet, Richard had one constant in his life, his best friend Tom, who had been by his side for over 40 years. They had met as young men in their early 20s, bonding over a shared love of hiking, reading, and long, late-night talks about life. Over the years, their friendship had only grown stronger. But beneath Richard's quiet demeanor, there was a secret he had carried with him for decades. A secret so deep that it weighed heavily on him as his health deteriorated. It was a Sunday afternoon, the room dimly lit by the soft light streaming through the window. Richard had been battling cancer for several months, and his body was frail, almost fragile. Lena had been caring for him, helping him with basic needs as he neared the final stage of his life. She'd gotten to know Richard well during her time caring for him, but it wasn't until that afternoon that he shared something with her that would leave a lasting impact on her heart. Richard, in a rare moment of vulnerability, asked Lena to sit beside him. His voice was weak but steady, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrest of his bed. "Lena, there's something I need to say, something I've never told anyone before. It's been eating at me for so long, and now, with the end so close, I think it's time to speak my truth." Lena was quiet, her eyes softening as she leaned in, offering him the space he needed to share whatever was on his heart. What Richard said next would forever change Lena's perspective on love and regret. For the first time in his life, Richard admitted he had been in love with his best friend Tom, for as long as he could remember. He described how, from the very beginning of their friendship, there had been an unspoken bond, a connection that went beyond friendship. But Richard had never been able to express his feelings. It started when we were younger, just two guys who enjoyed the simple things in life. But over the years, I realized it was more than that. Tom, he was my world, Lena. He didn't know it, but I was in love with him, and I always have been. But I never said anything. I was too afraid. Afraid that if I told him, it would ruin everything. Afraid that I'd lose him as a friend. And so I kept quiet. All these years, all this time, I kept it all inside. Richard's voice cracked with emotion as he continued, and Lena could feel the weight of his words. I watched him get married, have kids, live his life, and I just stood there, pretending that everything was fine. But deep down, I've never been happy about it. I never had the courage to tell him how I felt. I just let it all pass me by, and now I'm dying, and I regret it more than anything in this world. I never told him the truth, and now I'll never get the chance. Tears welled up in Richard's eyes as he spoke, and Lena could see the pain that had been buried beneath his stoic exterior for so many years. It was the pain of unrequited love, of a lifetime spent in silence, holding back something so deeply important. He paused for a moment as if collecting his thoughts. I just wish I had said something. I wish I had the courage to tell him. Maybe, just maybe, things would have been different. But now, it's too late. I never got the chance. Lena sat silently, absorbing the weight of Richard's confession. She could feel the depth of his pain, the profound regret of a man who had spent his entire life hiding the most important truth from the one person who mattered most. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if releasing the last of his sorrow, and then turned to Lena, a slight, bittersweet smile on his lips. "It's okay, Lena. I just wanted to say it out loud. I just wanted to let it go before I leave this world. I hope that wherever Tom is, he knows the truth, and I hope he's happy. I can't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, I'll find peace knowing I finally said it." Lena squeezed his hand gently, offering him the comfort of her presence as he took his last breath. He passed away later that night, at peace in a way that he hadn't been for so long. Richard's confession stayed with Lena long after his death, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the things we often leave unsaid. The truths we hide from ourselves and others out of fear. For Richard, it was the unspoken love for his best friend, a love that had never been shared, but that had defined his entire life. Number 6. The buried treasure. A secret wealth unearthed. Nurse Maria Fitzgerald had worked in palliative care for over a decade, and she had grown accustomed to witnessing the many ways in which the human spirit prepares for death. But the case of Mr. Gerald Pennington, a wealthy elderly man in his final days, was unlike any she had ever encountered. Gerald Pennington was well known in his community. He had made his fortune decades ago in the oil industry, and in his later years he had become a somewhat reclusive figure. Though his wealth was vast, he had no interest in flaunting it. He lived alone in a large, sprawling mansion situated on acres of land. His children, from a distant marriage, were grown and scattered across the country, often only visiting when they wanted something from him. Gerald had always been wary of others' motives, particularly when it came to his own flesh and blood. When Nurse Maria first began caring for him, Gerald was already in the advanced stages of a terminal illness. His body was frail, his once sharp mind now clouded by age and sickness. Yet, despite his physical decline, he was still remarkably sharp-witted and mentally aware. Maria had quickly grown fond of him, as he had a gruff but gentle demeanor, always speaking with a kind of old-school wisdom. It was during one of those quiet late-night shifts that Maria experienced something truly unexpected. Gerald, barely able to speak above a whisper, called her over to his bedside. "Maria, there's something I need to tell you." His voice crackled with the weight of the secret he had been carrying for so long. She leaned in, anticipating another routine confession, or perhaps a reflection on his past. But what he said next would change everything. "I buried a large amount of money under the old oak tree in my backyard. No one ever found it," Gerald murmured, his eyes darting nervously to the window, as though he feared someone might overhear. "I didn't trust the banks, and I sure didn't want my greedy children to get their hands on it. It's all mine, buried deep. They'll never find it. But I have to tell someone, in case. Maria was taken aback by the confession. She had heard stories of people hiding their wealth, especially from family members they didn't trust. But this was different. Gerald, a man of immense fortune, had made sure that no one, not even his children, could get their hands on his hidden treasure. She could feel the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just some casual remark. It was a secret he had carried with him throughout his life. And now, as death loomed closer, he had chosen to share it. "Under the old oak tree in the corner of the yard, there's a spot near the roots," he said weakly, almost as if he was giving her the keys to a kingdom of secrets. "If anyone ever comes looking, you tell them, it's not theirs, it's mine, and it always will be." Maria promised she wouldn't tell anyone, but the curiosity nagged at her. Over the next few days, Gerald's condition worsened, and he passed away quietly in his sleep. Maria respected his wishes, but the image of that old oak tree and the treasure buried beneath it haunted her thoughts. She knew his family would eventually be cleaning out the house, and she wondered whether they would ever find the fortune he had left behind. A few weeks later, as expected, the family arrived, carrying with them a mix of grief, frustration, and, as Maria could tell, a bit of greed. They began sorting through the house, taking stock of their father's possessions. They didn't seem particularly surprised by his death, as they had been estranged from him for years, only contacting him when they needed something. But Maria, still working at the facility, couldn't help but feel that they were only interested in what they could gain from his passing. One afternoon, as she was leaving the facility, she ran into one of Gerald's sons, Hugh, who asked her if she had any knowledge of where his father might have kept his wealth. Maria remained silent, but she couldn't help but remember what Gerald had told her. The next day, Maria returned to the mansion with some of the staff to assist with final tasks. She couldn't resist, and at her first opportunity, she decided to discreetly head to the old oak tree in the backyard. The tree had always been a strong, ancient fixture of the property, its roots sprawling in every direction. After carefully scanning the yard, she began digging near the corner where Gerald had described. What she uncovered shocked her to the core. Tins. Several old metal tins, buried deep beneath the earth. As she pried them open, she discovered what Gerald had kept hidden for so long. Stacks of cash, gold coins, and valuable jewelry, all wrapped carefully and kept away from the world. It wasn't just a small amount of money either. There was enough to set up a small fortune, likely more than anyone had guessed. Soon after, the family was informed of the discovery. At first, they were skeptical, but after an inspection by a lawyer, it was confirmed that the buried treasure was indeed Gerald's, and it became part of his estate. The children, who had always been so focused on inheriting his fortune, were left speechless. They hadn't even considered the possibility that their father had hidden away such wealth in an obscure corner of the property. As the family continued to divide the inheritance, they couldn't help but wonder why Gerald had chosen to keep this secret from them, and why he had buried it so carefully. The money and gold had remained untouched for so long, but in the end, it wasn't about the riches. It was about a father's way of keeping his legacy and wealth from those he felt did not deserve it. Maria never told anyone else about the buried treasure. She had honored Gerald's secret, and now, as she looked back on his final days, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for a man who had chosen to live his life on his own terms, even in death. This story reminds us of the length some people go to in order to protect their wealth and keep secrets from their loved ones. Gerald Pennington's hidden treasure was more than just a physical object. It was a symbol of his deep mistrust and desire to control his legacy, even after he was gone. Number 7. The baby swap. A dark act of revenge. Nurse Evelyn Parsons had spent her entire career in the small-town hospital where she had been trained as a young woman. Known for her quiet dedication to her work, she had seen it all: births, deaths, joy, and sorrow. But there was one event she had always kept buried in the recesses of her mind, a secret so dark and twisted that she had never shared it with a soul, until her final days. Evelyn had worked in the hospital for over 40 years. She had witnessed generations of families pass through its doors, some with joy, others with grief. The hospital, although small, was the heart of the town, where most people had been born and later brought their own children. Everyone knew everyone else, and the sense of community was palpable. One fateful day, when Evelyn was in her early 30s, a situation arose that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A wealthy couple, the Smiths, had come into the hospital expecting their first child. They were known in the community for their arrogance and superiority, especially towards those they deemed lesser than themselves. The Smiths had always treated the hospital staff poorly, particularly Evelyn, who was still young at the time. They often made condescending remarks, belittled her, and treated her as though she were inferior to them. Evelyn's resentment had been building over time, especially as she watched the way they treated others. The doctors, the nurses, and even the patients. They always expected special treatment, as if their wealth made them more deserving of respect. Evelyn had learned the hard way to keep her frustrations in check. But when the Smiths arrived at the hospital to deliver their child, she had had enough. That day, another family, the Watsons, had also arrived. The Watsons were a humble, hard-working couple who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town. They were well-liked by everyone, always kind and generous. Unfortunately, their financial situation had always been a struggle. Their joy at the arrival of their firstborn was undeniable, but Evelyn noticed that the couple's excitement was tempered by their fears about the cost of medical bills and their uncertain future. The Smiths had no such worries. They arrived with an air of entitlement, demanding the best of everything the hospital had to offer. Their son was born without complications, a healthy baby boy who would inherit the wealth and privilege of the Smith family. The Watsons, on the other hand, were struggling with a difficult birth, but they too welcomed their child into the world. A beautiful little girl, full of promise. As Evelyn walked the hallways of the maternity ward, she overheard the Smiths complaining loudly about the hospital's lack of luxury accommodations. She overheard them mocking the Watsons for being poor, and the words worthless and undeserving rang in her ears as they spoke about the young couple in the next room. That's when a dark thought began to form in her mind. In the blur of emotion and frustration, Evelyn made a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. It was a momentary lapse in judgment, a flash of anger that spiraled into something far worse than she had ever anticipated. She knew that the families would be separated briefly for some routine tests. It was then that she took action. In the middle of the night, Evelyn swapped the babies. The Watsons' newborn daughter, healthy and crying softly, was placed in the Smiths' nursery. The Smiths' son, who had been brought into the world with all the privileges they had come to expect, was placed into the Watsons' crib. She thought it would be a simple act, a harmless form of revenge. After all, the Smiths would never notice, would they? But Evelyn didn't anticipate the deep consequences of what she was doing. The next morning, as the families were preparing to leave the hospital, neither the Smiths nor the Watsons seemed to notice the switch. The babies were both healthy, and the nurses who conducted their final checkups didn't raise any red flags. But as the years passed, Evelyn began to realize the true extent of what she had done. She had ruined 2 lives, or had she? Over time, both families raised the children as their own. The Watsons, who had never questioned the arrival of their son, gave him all the love they had to offer. He grew up strong and healthy, with the same work ethic and kindness as his parents. Meanwhile, the Smiths raised the girl, who was showered with wealth, privilege, and opportunities. She had everything she could ever want, except for the love and humility that came with it. Evelyn lived in quiet torment, unable to confess her crime. She couldn't undo the damage she had caused, and it weighed heavily on her. As the years passed, she would see the families grow up, and occasionally she would hear whispers about the odd feelings the children had about their upbringing. The boy raised by the Smiths had a growing sense of disconnection from his parents, and the girl raised by the Watsons never quite fit in with her new family's way of life. Eventually, as Evelyn grew older, her health began to decline. It was in the final weeks of her life, as she lay in her bed, that the guilt became too much for her to bear. She called for her family and confessed the entire story. With tears in her eyes, she explained everything, how she had switched the babies, and why. She spoke of her anger and frustration at the way the Smiths had treated her. But she also admitted that her decision had been driven by something much darker: her own jealousy, bitterness, and a need to feel some kind of power over those who had belittled her. As Evelyn approached her death, she expressed remorse for the pain her actions had caused, but also a strange sense of finality. "I hope they were happy anyway," she whispered in her last moments, thinking of the 2 children who had been unknowingly affected by her rage. She died without knowing how the lives of the families would unfold in the future. Years later, the truth came to light. The now adult children, both confused about their origins, went on their own journeys of self-discovery. It was only through a series of DNA tests that the shocking truth of the baby swap was uncovered, causing a rift between the families. The Smiths and the Watsons never fully reconciled, and the children, now grown, struggled with their identity and sense of belonging. Evelyn Parsons, though long gone, left behind a legacy of guilt and a poignant reminder of how one impulsive decision, driven by anger and revenge, could alter the course of so many lives. The damage, though buried for years, would never be fully healed. Number 8. The Silent Witness, a lifetime of guilt. Charles Griffin had always been a quiet man. A retired factory worker, he spent most of his life working in a steel plant in a small town in the Midwest. He was well respected by his colleagues for his work ethic and unassuming nature, but he carried a dark secret, one that had haunted him for more than half of his life. It was a secret that, even in the final hours of his life, weighed heavily on him. Charles had started working at the factory when he was just 18 years old. The factory was known for its dangerous machinery, and the work was hard, often grueling, but it paid well. It was a job that many people depended on, and Charles was no different. He worked his shifts with a steady focus, doing what he could to get by, just like everyone else. But one day, everything changed. It was a day like any other. Charles was in the factory, working at his station near a large piece of heavy machinery. The sound of clanking metal and whirring machines filled the air, and the atmosphere was filled with the usual hum of industrial work. It was chaotic, loud, and fast-paced. Then suddenly it happened. One of his co-workers, Tommy Hughes, was working just a few feet away from Charles. Tommy was a younger man, perhaps in his late 20s, and was known for his easygoing nature. He had a reputation for cracking jokes and making people laugh even in the toughest of times. But that day, as Tommy was working on a piece of machinery, something went horribly wrong. As Charles watched in horror, Tommy slipped. He was standing too close to the moving parts of a piece of heavy equipment. The machinery was powerful, and Tommy's body was sucked in. There was no time to react. It was like everything had frozen for a moment. Charles stood there, paralyzed by fear as Tommy screamed, his voice quickly drowned out by the sound of the grinding machinery. Within seconds, the factory floor fell eerily silent. Charles knew that he should help. He should have screamed for help or rushed to his side, but instead, a deep sense of panic overtook him. He was terrified of being blamed for Tommy's accident, terrified that the factory would hold him responsible for what had just happened. For a split second, he thought about rushing to the emergency stop button to shut the machinery down, but his legs refused to move. His mind raced, but his body stood frozen. Instead of helping Tommy, Charles did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his panic, he turned and ran. He bolted out of the area, down the long factory corridors, and out the back exit. He didn't stop running until he was safely away from the scene, and when he finally looked back, he could hear the sirens of the emergency responders approaching the building. He never went back to check on Tommy. Later, the factory officials ruled the incident an accident. They said Tommy's death was simply the result of a mistake, a tragic moment where the machinery malfunctioned. No one suspected foul play, and no one ever knew that someone had witnessed the horrifying event. Charles, for all intents and purposes, had gotten away with it. He was not blamed, and no one ever knew the truth. But Charles knew. He knew what he had done. For years, he tried to bury the memory of that day, but it gnawed at him from within. Every time he closed his eyes, Tommy's face would appear in his mind. Every night, he would see Tommy's terrified expression, the look of helplessness on his face as he was pulled into the machinery. It was a vision that never left him. Decades passed, and Charles went on with his life. He married, had children, and moved into a modest home. But Tommy's face never left him. The guilt, the shame, the fear, it followed him everywhere he went. The memory of his inaction, his decision to flee rather than help, weighed on him like a heavy burden. As the years went by, the images of Tommy became more vivid. Charles would lie awake at night, sweating and trembling, as the nightmare replayed itself over and over. He tried to drown out the guilt with work, with family, and with alcohol, but nothing could erase the haunting vision of Tommy's face. Now, as an elderly man, Charles had been suffering from a number of health problems. He had lived a full life, but the years had taken their toll. He knew that his time was coming to an end. It was during his final days, lying in a hospice bed, that he finally found the courage to speak the truth. The nurse who had been caring for him, a kind woman named Janet, sat by his side as he confessed his long-held secret. He told her everything, about the moment of Tommy's death, his fear, his panicked decision to run away, and the guilt that had consumed him for more than 50 years. "I've seen his face every night in my dreams for 50 years, Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to forget, but I never could. I ran when I should have helped him. And now it's too late. I can't undo what I've done. I never told anyone, not a soul." Janet sat silently, not knowing what to say. Charles wept quietly, his frail body shaking with the weight of the years of guilt that had finally been released. The remorse was etched into every line of his face. "I hope he can forgive me," Charles said in his final moments. "I don't know if I can forgive myself." Charles passed away shortly after, his body finally at rest, but his soul burdened with the memory of his actions. It's unclear whether Tommy, in some other realm, had heard his confession or whether he had ever found peace. But Charles's deathbed confession marked the end of a lifelong torment, a reminder of the cost of a single moment of cowardice. Janet, the nurse who had listened to his confession, would never forget Charles or the haunting truth he had carried for so long. It was a reminder that sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we carry in our hearts, and the toll they take on our souls can last far beyond a lifetime. Number 9. The arsonist's regret, a lifetime of guilt. In the small, rural town of Riverside, there were few people who didn't know the Barker family. The Barkers had lived on their sprawling farm for generations, known for their hardworking nature and their beautiful animals. But for all the good things they were known for, there was one event that would forever change the course of their lives, a tragedy that would haunt an innocent man until his death, and one that only came to light decades later. Ethel Barker was a quiet, kind-hearted woman in her late 70s when she found herself in a hospice bed, nearing the end of her long life. By that time, most of her children were grown, and her husband, Jack, had passed away many years earlier. She had lived a full life, but one thing still weighed heavily on her heart. It was a secret she had carried for decades, a burden that had gnawed at her soul every single day. It started when Ethel was just 16 years old, a teenager with a mischievous streak. She was never one to be overly rebellious, but like many teenagers, she was restless, eager to experience life beyond the boundaries of her family's farm. The Barker farm was large, with acres of land, crops, and various animals, cattle, chickens, pigs, and horses. It was a busy place, full of life, but that meant there were always things to do, always work to be done. One summer day, Ethel had been playing in the barn, a large wooden structure used to house the farm's animals. She had been careless, not really paying attention to the task she was supposed to be doing. She was bored and frustrated by the routine, and as she wandered through the barn, she picked up a matchbook that had been left in the corner. In her youthful curiosity, she struck a match. At first, it was just a flicker of light, but as she absent-mindedly played with the match, she accidentally dropped it onto a pile of hay in the corner. The dry hay quickly caught fire, and the flames spread faster than she could react. At first, Ethel tried to put out the fire with her bare hands, but it was too late. The flames quickly grew, engulfing the barn in seconds. Panicked, she ran out of the barn to get help, but the fire spread so quickly that by the time help arrived, it was already too late. The entire barn was lost to the flames. Several animals, unable to escape the fire, perished in the blaze. It was a devastating blow to the Barker family, as the barn had been a cornerstone of their livelihood. They had lost valuable livestock and years of work in a matter of minutes. Ethel was in shock. She couldn't believe what had just happened. But what weighed on her even more was the fact that she had caused it. And to make matters worse, she didn't tell anyone. Instead, she stood there, watching as the fire burned. When the fire department arrived and the smoke cleared, the blame was placed squarely on Jack Barker, her father. The authorities ruled the fire as an accident caused by negligence. They believed that Jack, who had been busy working on the farm that day, had accidentally left a lantern too close to a pile of hay, causing the fire. Jack was a proud man, a hard worker who had always done his best to provide for his family. But when the fire broke out, he was devastated. He never once suspected that his daughter, in her moment of carelessness, had started the fire herself. He was blamed, shamed by the community, and left to live with the guilt. The community turned on Jack. They whispered behind his back, talked about his carelessness, and blamed him for the tragedy. The townspeople, who had once held him in high regard, now saw him as irresponsible and negligent. Jack's reputation was shattered, and his once thriving farm fell into financial ruin. The shame and guilt weighed heavily on him, and as the years went on, it seemed like he could never escape the shadows of that one tragic day. Jack died several years later, worn down by the relentless guilt. He never knew the truth. He went to his grave thinking that he had caused the death of the animals, the destruction of the barn, and the loss of his family's livelihood. He died with the weight of the world on his shoulders, never suspecting that it was his own daughter who had caused it all. Ethel had kept the secret to herself, carrying the burden of guilt in silence. She couldn't bring herself to tell anyone, especially not her father. The shame of what she had done haunted her every single day. She had watched as her father's health deteriorated, knowing that the guilt he carried was not his own, but hers. She had seen the pain in his eyes, and it broke her heart to know that he had died, never knowing the truth. Now, years later, Ethel found herself in a hospice bed, surrounded by her children. She had lived a long life, but the regret was still there, as fresh and raw as the day the fire had started. She knew that it was time to confess, to finally release the burden that had been eating away at her for so long. One evening, as the nurse, Margaret, sat by her bedside, Ethel turned to her and said, "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone." Margaret, who had grown quite fond of Ethel during her time in the hospice, nodded gently, encouraging her to continue. Ethel's voice was shaky as she spoke, her eyes clouded with years of regret. "When I was a teenager," Ethel began, her voice breaking, "I started the fire. It was me. I didn't mean to, but I was careless. I was playing with matches in the barn, and I dropped one. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. I watched the fire destroy everything, and I ran. My father, he thought he caused it. He spent the rest of his life believing he was to blame. The town turned on him. He died with that guilt. He thought it was his fault. I'll never forgive myself for that." Ethel's voice trailed off as tears welled up in her eyes. Margaret, unable to find words to ease the pain, simply held her hand and sat in silence, allowing Ethel to release the secret that had tormented her for so many years. The nurse knew that in that moment, Ethel had found a small piece of peace. She had finally confessed the truth, and while it couldn't bring Jack back, it could bring some closure to a lifetime of regret. Ethel passed away soon after, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had carried the weight of the world for so long, but now, at last, the truth was out. Number 10. The Poisoned Husband, a dark and chilling confession. In the small, quiet town of Cedarwood, nestled deep in the countryside, lived a woman named Vivian Harper. By the time she was nearing her 80s, she was well known in the community. To most, she was just another elderly woman who lived alone in her home, a widow who had been living in peace after the death of her husband many years ago. But beneath the surface of her calm exterior lay a dark secret. A secret she had carried with her for decades, one she had never once spoken aloud. Vivian had married Harold Harper in the late 1940s, in a time when societal expectations for women were rigid, and divorce was still considered taboo. Harold was a man of considerable wealth, and their marriage had been one of convenience, with Vivian initially drawn to his good looks and charm. At first, their life together seemed promising. Harold was well-liked in the town, respected for his business dealings, and praised for his apparent generosity. However, the charm that had won Vivian over soon faded, replaced by cruelty and control. From the start, Harold's true nature was revealed behind closed doors. He was a violent and abusive man, one who belittled and controlled Vivian at every turn. His verbal abuse was constant, eroding her self-esteem, while his physical temper was quick to flare. He would often lash out at her, his anger uncontrollable. Over time, Vivian's life became a daily struggle for survival in the suffocating grip of her husband's cruelty. There was no escape, and she had no one to turn to. The town saw the outward appearance of a successful marriage, but no one knew the hell Vivian endured behind the closed doors of their home. The physical and emotional abuse Vivian suffered grew worse with time, and by the 1960s, she had reached her breaking point. Harold's outbursts had become more frequent, his rages more violent. He would often return home from his business dealings, drunk and enraged, ready to take out his frustrations on Vivian. The bruises on her body and the brokenness in her spirit grew deeper with each passing day. She had no family to rely on and no friends who would intervene. Vivian knew that she couldn't keep going on like this. Every day felt like she was living on the edge, waiting for the next outburst. She began to fear for her life, afraid that one day Harold might kill her in a fit of rage. But as the years passed, a chilling thought began to take shape in her mind. She wondered if there was a way out, an escape from the torment she had suffered for so long. It was then that she came up with a plan. She knew that antifreeze, which was easily accessible at the time, could be a deadly poison. It was tasteless and odorless, making it difficult to detect in food or drink. Harold had a habit of drinking large amounts of liquor in the evenings, and it wasn't long before Vivian began to slowly add small doses of antifreeze to his drinks. At first, she was cautious. She didn't want to raise any suspicions, so she made sure to add only small amounts to his glass of whiskey or to the evening cocktails they shared. She watched as Harold began to feel unwell, his stomach upset, his health declining slowly over time. He became more and more fatigued, and his complaints about feeling sick became more frequent. Vivian, in turn, played the role of the concerned wife, always offering him comfort and making excuses for his condition. The poisoning continued for months. Vivian's strategy was slow and deliberate, ensuring that Harold would not realize that he was being poisoned, that no one would notice the gradual deterioration of his health. She would add just enough antifreeze to keep his condition worsening without arousing suspicion. The poison was a silent killer, a slow-acting agent that allowed her to live in the shadows, undetected. Eventually, Harold's health deteriorated to the point where he became bedridden. Doctors were baffled by his symptoms. They could not determine what was causing his sudden decline. Vivian, ever the devoted wife, was right by his side, tending to him with feigned care. As the days passed, Harold's strength continued to fade. He would drift in and out of consciousness, unable to even remember what had been happening to him. Finally, one night, after months of slow poisoning, Harold succumbed to his illness and died in his sleep. The death was ruled as natural causes. There was no investigation, no suspicion. After all, Harold had been an older man, and he had been complaining of feeling unwell for some time. No one ever questioned it. Vivian, in the public eye, mourned her husband's passing, but privately, a sense of relief washed over her. The torment was finally over. She was free. Vivian would go on to live another 40 years in that same small town, always maintaining the image of the grieving widow. She never remarried, and she never spoke of her late husband except to express her sorrow. But deep inside, she carried her secret. It haunted her, though not in the way one might expect. There was no guilt. In fact, Vivian felt a sense of relief. She had survived the only way she knew how, by removing the source of her suffering. And so, she carried this dark secret with her for the rest of her life. The people around her never suspected the truth, and Vivian remained a quiet, unassuming presence in the town. She became known for her calm demeanor and her kindness, a woman who had endured hardship and come out the other side. But all the while, she carried the knowledge of what she had done. The poison she had administered to her husband over time, the way she had chosen to end his life, rather than endure the agony of his abuse any longer. As Vivian neared the end of her life, she found herself in a hospice bed, surrounded by the same familiar faces she had known for decades. One evening, as the nurse Janet sat by her bedside, Vivian, with a calmness that was chilling, confessed the dark truth. She had waited so long to say it out loud, but the time had come. "I need to tell you something," Vivian said, her voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I poisoned him. I killed my husband. I had to. He was abusive. I couldn't take it anymore. It was the only way I knew to survive." Janet, who had been a nurse for many years and had heard her fair share of confessions, was taken aback by the calmness with which Vivian spoke. There was no remorse in her voice, no sense of regret. Instead, it was as if she had finally unburdened herself after all these years. Vivian went on to explain the details, the slow, methodical way she had poisoned Harold over time, the lack of suspicion, and the sense of relief she felt after his death. She spoke with a sense of finality, as though this confession was the last thing she needed to say before her own time came. When she finished, she simply closed her eyes and lay back against her pillows. She was silent, as though waiting for something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps an acknowledgement. But none came. Vivian Harper passed away quietly in her sleep a few days later, her secret finally revealed. The town would never know the truth, but in the quiet of that hospice room, it was known. Vivian Harper had taken the life of her husband, but it was done in the name of survival, in the name of freedom. Number 11. The War Crimes, a Soldier's Last Confession. In a quiet nursing home in a small town, an elderly man named Henry Clarkson spent his final days reflecting on his past. He had always kept to himself, rarely talking about the years he had spent serving in the military during World War II. To the outside world, Henry was just another old man with a foggy memory and a quiet demeanor. But beneath the surface, Henry was carrying the weight of something far darker and far more significant than anyone knew. Henry had enlisted in the military when he was just 18 years old, full of youthful patriotism and eager to serve his country. He was deployed to Europe, where he quickly found himself thrust into the chaos of war. At first, the horrors of combat seemed like something from a nightmare. The sounds of artillery fire, the screams of fallen comrades, and the overwhelming sense of fear were all too much for him to handle. But over time, as the brutality of war became his daily reality, Henry learned to push aside his emotions, focusing instead on survival. As he advanced through the ranks, Henry became part of a specialized unit that was tasked with some of the most dangerous and ethically questionable missions. War crimes were a term Henry would never have associated with himself when he first joined the army. But in the heat of battle, amidst the fog of war, the lines between right and wrong often became blurred. It was in those brutal, blood-soaked days on the front lines that Henry committed acts he would spend the rest of his life regretting. During one particularly horrific mission in France, Henry's unit was ordered to take out an enemy stronghold. The mission was supposed to be swift and precise, but things quickly went awry. What was meant to be a strategic assault turned into a massacre. In the chaos, Henry and his comrades found themselves in a situation where the enemy was forced to surrender. But instead of taking prisoners, Henry's unit executed the captured soldiers. He had not personally pulled the trigger, but he had been complicit. The commanding officer gave the order, and the soldiers under his command followed without question. Henry would later recount how he had stood there, paralyzed with fear and confusion, as the soldiers were executed right before his eyes. He had not fought to stop it. Instead, he had closed his eyes and pretended it wasn't happening. But deep inside, he felt something die in him that day. Another incident occurred in Germany, where Henry's unit was ordered to raid a small village suspected of harboring enemy spies. The civilians, mostly women and children, were dragged out of their homes, rounded up, and herded into a barn. The soldiers were ordered to deal with them. This time, Henry could not justify the killings. He remembered the pleading eyes of a young mother holding her child, begging for mercy. But mercy was not on the agenda that day. Again, Henry did not personally pull the trigger, but he was there. He was part of the group that carried out the atrocities. He watched as his fellow soldiers ruthlessly gunned down the civilians. He remembered the look of terror on the faces of the children, the quiet screams of the women as they tried to shield their young ones from the gunfire. The whole village was wiped out in a matter of minutes. Years went by after the war ended, but Henry was haunted by these memories. The trauma he had witnessed, the innocent lives lost, and the guilt of being a part of it all never left him. He returned home as a hero, decorated for his bravery, but his mind was forever scarred by the violence he had witnessed and contributed to. His marriage fell apart, his relationships with friends and family became strained, and he found it impossible to shake the memories of the people he had helped kill, the atrocities he had helped to cover up. For decades, Henry carried the weight of his actions, burying the pain deep inside. He had never spoken to anyone about the war crimes he had witnessed and been complicit in. He lived with the shame and remorse, silently carrying it like a heavy burden. Over the years, he tried to numb himself with alcohol, trying to forget the faces of those he had murdered in cold blood. But it never worked. The memories would surface in his dreams, in moments of quiet reflection, always reminding him of the darkness that had become a part of him. Now, as he lay in his hospital bed in his twilight years, Henry Clarkson could no longer bear the weight of his guilt. His body was frail, and his mind was beginning to fade, but he could still remember the horrors of the war as if they had happened yesterday. One evening, as his nurse Emma sat with him, he finally spoke the words he had kept locked away for so long. He told her in a voice filled with sorrow the full extent of his involvement in the atrocities he had witnessed and been a part of. "I've carried this with me for so long," Henry said, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know what I did, what we did. I've killed people. I've watched innocent lives be destroyed, and I never did anything to stop it. I couldn't. I was just following orders. But now, I don't know if I can face my own soul when I die. I just want peace. I just want the guilt to go away, but I know it never will." Emma, who had heard many confessions from dying patients over the years, listened in silence. She knew that Henry wasn't looking for forgiveness from her or anyone else. He wasn't seeking absolution. What he sought, perhaps for the first time in his life, was peace. A moment of release from the unrelenting burden of guilt that had suffocated him for decades. As Henry spoke, Emma's heart ached for the broken man before her. She had heard many people speak of war, of the horrors and the sacrifices, but never had she heard someone speak of such deep and personal remorse. There was no pride in Henry's voice, no justification. He was just a man, broken by the sins of his youth, seeking solace before the end. That night, Henry passed away quietly in his sleep. His confession had been his final attempt to find peace, to atone for the darkness that had followed him for so long. Though he would never be able to undo the damage he had caused, his words would stay with Emma, a reminder of the lasting impact war has on the souls of those who are caught in its chaos. Number 12. The Secret Children, a life of hidden truths. The confession came quietly, almost like a whisper being carried away by the wind. Margaret O'Donnell, an 84-year-old woman nearing the end of her life in a hospice in Dublin, Ireland, asked to speak privately with her nurse, Clara Byrne, one late afternoon. Clara had sat with many patients in their final days, offering comfort, listening to regrets, and bearing witness to stories that had never been told before. But what Margaret was about to share would stay with her forever. Margaret had always been seen as a devoted wife and loving mother of 5. To neighbors, she was a classic homemaker, baking scones on Sundays, going to church with her family, and never missing a school recital. Her husband, Gerald, a quiet, stern man, had worked for the Postal Service for over 30 years before retiring. He passed away 5 years before Margaret, never questioning the paternity of his children, never suspecting the double life his wife had lived. "I need to tell someone," Margaret began, her voice shaking, "before I leave this world. I can't carry it anymore, not with this much weight on my chest." Clara gently encouraged her to go on. "I had an affair," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "It wasn't just a fling. It lasted over 22 years. And it wasn't just any man. It was Tommy Byrne, the city bus driver. Clara sat still, trying not to show her shock. I met him in my early 30s, when I used to take the bus every morning to the school where I worked part-time. Margaret continued. At first, it was just small talk. Weather, traffic, silly jokes. But he was kind to me in a way Gerald never was. He noticed things. When I wore new earrings, when I had a tough day. One day, after I missed the last bus and stood crying in the rain with a torn bag of groceries, he pulled over and offered to drive me home in his own car. That night changed everything. According to Margaret, their relationship started slowly, secretly, and then grew into something much deeper. Tommy, a bachelor with no family of his own, became her confidant, her escape. He never pressured her to leave her husband. They both knew what they were doing was wrong. But they couldn't stop. Their meetings became regular, sometimes in the back of the bus when it was parked for the night, other times in cheap motels far from town. She said that with Tommy, she felt alive, seen, and soft. Then she dropped the biggest truth of all. All 5 of my children, they might be his, Margaret said, voice cracking. I never had the courage to test, and I never wanted to know for sure, but the timing lines up for all of them. Clara stared, stunned into silence. 5 children, all of them had grown up calling Gerald Dad. And now, as adults with their own children, none of them had ever known there might be a different truth behind their origins. I never told Gerald he loved those children like his own, and I believe maybe they were his too, in spirit at least, Margaret said. But now, every time I look at my son Michael, I see Tommy's eyes. I've always known deep down. Margaret didn't want to ruin the lives of her children or tarnish the memory of Gerald. She had decided not to leave behind any written letters or confessions. She just needed someone to know. Someone who wouldn't judge her, but would understand the human heart. Clara asked if she regretted it. I regret the lies, Margaret answered, but not the love. I loved 2 men. One gave me a home, the other gave me a soul. Tommy had passed away nearly a decade ago, alone in a small apartment. Margaret had attended his funeral in secret, standing at the very back of the crowd with her face covered in a scarf. I never got to tell him goodbye, she whispered. By the end of the conversation, Margaret looked relieved, like a heavy cloud had lifted. She died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep, her secret safe with Clara. Number 13. The Hidden Identity, a Life Lived in Disguise. The story of Joseph Joe Klein, a soft-spoken man in his late 70s, unraveled quietly in a hospice room in Ontario, Canada. The nurse who sat beside him, Elisa Monroe, had been caring for him during his final weeks. Joe was known on the ward as a polite, kind gentleman who mostly kept to himself. He had 2 grown children, a loving wife who visited every day, and an accent no one could ever quite place. One evening, as the rain gently tapped the window beside his bed, Joe asked Elisa if she could sit with him for a while longer. His eyes looked heavy, not from illness, but from the weight of something that had clearly been buried for decades. I'm not who they think I am, he said quietly. Elisa leaned in, thinking she might have misheard. He continued, my name isn't really Joseph Klein, and I'm not from where I told them I was. I've lived a lie for nearly 50 years. Elisa encouraged him to speak freely. He nodded slowly and began to confess. Back in the 1960s, Joe said he fled Eastern Europe, a country ravaged by conflict and fear, where political dissent could land you in prison, or worse. At just 27 years old, he had worked as a translator for a foreign embassy, but when a wave of arrests began targeting people suspected of leaking information, Joe knew he would be next. He explained how, with the help of a sympathetic embassy contact, he escaped under a different name, using forged documents. He landed in Canada, where he decided to start over completely. I changed my name, my story, even my birthday. I burned the last photo of my mother so no one could trace me back. Joe met his wife, Helen, within a few years of arriving. He told her he was originally from Austria and had moved to Canada for better opportunities. They married, had 2 children, and he got a job in logistics, working for the same company until he retired. He never told anyone, not his wife, not even his brother, who eventually found his way to Germany and passed away without ever reconnecting with Joe. When Elisa asked why he never told the truth, Joe said, because I was scared that if I told, everything would unravel. They'd see me as a fraud. I thought I'd have time to tell them one day, But then the years slipped by. He said he didn't flee because of guilt. He fled because he knew what the regime was capable of. But over time, his silence had grown into shame. Not for what he did, but for never having the courage to tell the people who loved him who he truly was. Joe's biggest fear, even in his final days, was that his real past would be uncovered after his death, and his children would see his whole life as a lie. He asked Elisa to help him write a short letter to his wife and children, not revealing every detail, but enough to explain that he had once been a young man who had to choose between survival and truth. "I've lived a good life," he said with tears in his eyes, "but I always wondered what it would have felt like to live it as me." He passed away 3 days later, the letter tucked into a drawer with instructions for it to be read after the funeral. Elisa never revealed his original name, not to the staff, not to anyone. It was a piece of history, a quiet rebellion, and a hidden identity, taken to the grave, except for the small piece of truth he finally shared in his final moments. Number 14. The Secret Affair. A Lifetime of Love in the Shadows. This confession came from Margaret Maggie Halperin, a gentle, silver-haired woman in her mid-80s who had spent the last few weeks of her life in a small private hospice in Cleveland, Ohio. Her nurse, Tasha Reed, had developed a close bond with her. Maggie was the kind of patient who always smiled, always asked how everyone else was doing, even as her health rapidly declined. But behind her kind demeanor, she carried a secret that had haunted her for decades. One afternoon, just days before she passed, Tasha found Maggie gazing quietly at the old photo she kept by her bedside, her late husband Albert, smiling beside a man Maggie had always referred to as Uncle Henry, Albert's childhood best friend. With tears welling in her eyes, Maggie turned to Tasha and said, "Do you believe a person can love 2 people at once?" Tasha replied softly, "Yes, I think it's possible." Maggie took a deep breath and said, "Then I need to tell you something before I go. I've never told a soul, not even in confession." Over the next hour, Maggie revealed a story that was both heartbreaking and deeply human. She met her husband Albert and his best friend Henry Fields during the summer of 1955. The 3 of them were inseparable. Albert was charming, reliable, and safe, but Henry, he was quiet, thoughtful, a man of few words but many glances. Maggie confessed that the first spark of love she felt wasn't actually for her future husband but for his best friend. When Albert proposed, it made sense. He was stable, kind, good with my parents. Henry never made a move, so I said yes. Maggie married Albert, and for a while, life was as expected. 2 kids, a house in the suburbs, church every Sunday. But then one evening, about 5 years into her marriage, Henry dropped by to help Albert fix a pipe in the basement. Albert left to get tools, and in that moment alone, something shifted between Maggie and Henry. He looked at me, and I looked back, and it was like all the years we'd held it in came rushing out. That night was the beginning of a secret that would stretch on for nearly 30 years. They were careful. There were only a handful of physical encounters over the decades, always brief, always secret. But the emotional affair never stopped. They exchanged letters hidden in books, shared glances across dinner tables, took long walks under the guise of errands. It was a love that existed only in the shadows. Albert never found out. He passed away in 1996, never suspecting that the man he called his best friend and fishing partner had loved his wife in silence and in secret. Henry never married. He died 10 years later, alone. "I loved Henry with a part of my soul I could never share," Maggie whispered to Tasha, "but I loved Albert too. In a different way. I just never knew how to forgive myself for both." Maggie said her biggest regret wasn't just the betrayal, it was that she never got the chance to tell the truth to either of them. "I hope Albert forgives me, and I hope Henry knows he was the great love of my life." Maggie passed away 2 mornings later. Tasha sat beside her bed, holding her hand, remembering the story that would never be written in any obituary. A story of love, loss, guilt, and a lifetime of secrets buried in silence. Number 15. The Church Fire. A confession buried for 50 years. In a quiet hospice room in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Nurse Rachel Mendez sat by the side of an elderly patient named Elliot Granger, a retired mechanic in his late 80s. Elliot had been battling lung disease for months, and his condition had worsened rapidly over the last few days. He was a man of few words, always polite, always reserved. But in his final hours, something in his demeanor changed. He became restless, almost agitated, and kept mumbling about needing to clear the smoke. Rachel assumed it was a symptom of his declining condition, until Elliot suddenly grabbed her hand, locked eyes with her, and said, "I need to tell you something before I go. Something no one knows." Rachel encouraged him gently, sensing the weight of what was coming. With a voice cracked by time and guilt, Elliot began a confession that had haunted him for over 5 decades. In 1972, Elliot was 33 years old, newly divorced, and a regular attendee at St. Mark's Baptist Church, a small but lively congregation that served as a community anchor. He was close with the pastor at the time, Reverend Paul Whitmore, until a bitter disagreement erupted between them. Elliot had discovered that the Reverend had quietly denied his ex-wife access to the church's support program after their separation, even discouraging other members from helping her. Elliot was furious. "I felt betrayed, humiliated. That church was everything to me," he said. One night, drunk and consumed by anger, Elliot broke into the church with a can of gasoline. His original plan was to torch the pastor's office and send a message, but the flames spread faster than he expected. The old wooden building, dry from the summer heat, went up in a matter of minutes. He fled the scene before the fire trucks arrived, watching from across the street in a daze. What Elliot didn't know, what no one knew until the fire was out, was that a homeless man named Charles Dean had been sleeping in the back pew that night. He died in the blaze, his body found under collapsed beams. The fire department blamed faulty wiring. The church had been having electrical issues for years. No one questioned it further. Insurance paid out. A new church was built. Life went on. But Elliot never forgot. Every time he passed by the new building, he saw the flames in his mind. He stopped going to church entirely. He never spoke of that night. He married again, had children, worked hard, but the weight of that death never left him. "I see that man's face every time I close my eyes," he told Rachel, tears streaming down his cheeks. "He didn't deserve that. I didn't even know he was there." Rachel asked him gently why he never told anyone. "Because no one would have believed it was an accident, and I couldn't take that from my family, not after everything." His final words that night, spoken in a whisper so quiet Rachel had to lean in close, were, "It was me, it was always me." Elliot passed away just before dawn. Rachel later shared the confession anonymously on a nursing forum, not to accuse, but to release the story into the world. A secret held too long, a truth that needed air. Number 16. The Silent Sister, a secret that haunted a lifetime. In the last months of her battle with cancer, 72-year-old Margaret Maggie Collins found herself surrounded by the soft hum of hospice life at St. Anne's, a small care center in a quiet town. Known for her gentle smile and warm heart, Maggie had lived a life that many admired. Yet beneath that serene exterior, she carried a secret so heavy it had shadowed her every step since she was a teenager. It was during one quiet, rain-soaked afternoon that Maggie finally gathered the courage to reveal what she had kept hidden for over 50 years. As her nurse, Joanne, sat by her bedside, Maggie's voice quivered with both sorrow and remorse. "I need you to know the truth," she whispered. "I was never the same after that day." Maggie recounted a memory from the late 1950s, when she was just 16. Growing up in a modest home in a tight-knit community, the Collins family had always been close, until one fateful evening changed everything. Maggie and her younger sister June had been inseparable, sharing secrets and dreams in the small attic of their family home. But as teenagers, even the closest bonds can fracture under the weight of impulsive emotions. Maggie explained that one evening, June had stumbled upon something Margaret had done, something that Maggie had spent weeks hiding. Fearful of the consequences and desperate to protect herself, Maggie had begged June to keep the secret. But June, driven by a mix of curiosity and a desire to expose what she saw as wrong, threatened to tell their parents. In that charged moment, an eruption of fear and anger took over Maggie. She recalled the sensation of time slowing down as she stood at the top of a creaking wooden staircase. Before she could fully think, her trembling hand reached out, and in a flash of misguided desperation, She pushed June. The memory was vivid. The sound of June's startled gasp, the sickening thud as she tumbled down the stairs, and the horrifying silence that followed. It wasn't long before their parents discovered the aftermath. The fall had broken June's neck in a way that made any hope of recovery impossible. The incident was ruled an accident, a terrible misfortune that no one suspected to have been caused intentionally. Maggie's parents were heartbroken, but never questioned the true nature of the tragedy. For decades, Maggie lived with the crushing burden of that day. Every family gathering, every milestone in her life, was underscored by a secret that festered in the depths of her soul. She never spoke of June to her children, who grew up unaware of the dark truth behind the loss of their aunt. The guilt consumed her, and she often felt that every smile hid a well of sorrow. "I see her face every time I close my eyes," Maggie confided softly, her eyes distant and full of regret. "She died because of me. I pushed her when I was scared, and no one ever suspected it." The confession, delivered in that hushed, remorseful tone, was not an attempt to absolve herself, but a desperate, final search for self-forgiveness. Maggie admitted that she had tried to atone for her actions in small, silent ways throughout her life. She had supported various charity causes, particularly those helping troubled youth, in hopes of somehow counteracting the destruction her impulse had caused. Yet, the wound never fully healed. That day in St. Anne's, as the rain pattered softly against the window, Maggie's truth was laid bare. Nurse Joanne held her hand throughout the confession, offering nothing more than the quiet empathy that no words could replace. In those final moments, Maggie's secret, buried for over half a century, was finally out in the open, a confession both tragic and transformative. Maggie passed away a week later, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow intertwined with compassion. Her final admission, raw and painful, served as a stark reminder that sometimes the heaviest burdens are those we carry in silence. Her story, once locked away in the recesses of a troubled heart, became a haunting echo of regret and a solemn plea for forgiveness that, in the end, was only for herself. Number 17. The false accusation, a life destroyed by one lie. In the final days of her life, Mrs. Eleanor Pratt, a retired school teacher in her late 70s, lay in a hospice bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the occasional soft footsteps of nurses. She had lived a life of service, dedicating over 30 years to teaching literature in a suburban high school. Her former students remembered her as stern but brilliant, and many still praised her lessons years later. But behind the accolades was a truth she had buried for decades, one she could no longer carry to her grave. One quiet evening, as Nurse Cynthia Monroe was adjusting Eleanor's IV line, the elderly woman motioned for her to sit down. Her voice was weak but insistent. "I have to tell someone before I go," she said. "Something I did, something terrible." What Eleanor revealed next would haunt the nurse for years. In her early 30s, Eleanor had started teaching at a new school, fresh out of a complicated breakup and feeling lonely, angry, and emotionally volatile. That year, she met Mr. James Alcott, a fellow teacher, kind, charismatic, and well-liked by both students and staff. They worked closely on several school projects, and Eleanor, still mending her broken heart, developed feelings for him. She thought he felt the same. One evening after a faculty fundraiser, Eleanor made a bold move. She confessed her feelings to James and leaned in to kiss him. He pulled away gently, apologizing and saying he didn't see her that way. He told her he valued her as a colleague and didn't want things to be awkward between them. But to Eleanor, it wasn't just rejection, it felt like humiliation. Fueled by pride and heartache, and perhaps not fully understanding the weight of her actions, Eleanor made a false accusation the next day. She told the school principal that James had made inappropriate advances toward her after the fundraiser. In that era, before thorough investigative protocols, it was her word against his, and her clean record as a respected teacher tipped the scales. James was placed on immediate leave, and despite his adamant denials, pressure from the school board and parents mounted. Within a month, he was quietly fired to avoid scandal. Rumors spread. Other schools wouldn't hire him once the whispers reached their ears. His reputation was shattered. He eventually left town and faded into obscurity. "I watched it all happen," Eleanor confessed, her eyes filling with tears. "I kept thinking I'd take it back, The next day, the next week, but I never did. I watched him lose everything, his job, his career, his peace of mind, and I said nothing. He didn't deserve that, not for a second. She told Nurse Cynthia that over the years, she tried to rationalize it, tried to bury the guilt under decades of service and good deeds, but the truth never left her. She had searched online for him over the years, but found nothing. "I don't know if he's still alive. I don't know if he ever healed," she whispered. "But I destroyed a good man's life because I was angry. I'll answer to God for that." Eleanor passed away 3 days later. Her story never made headlines, and her secret never reached Mr. Alcott. But her final confession was not just a release. It was a tragic reminder of how a single lie, born from pride and pain, can alter the course of someone else's life forever. That one was chilling, wasn't it? It really makes you think about how deep some secrets can go, and how long people carry the weight of their actions. What do you think about Eleanor's confession? Do you believe people like her deserve peace after revealing such devastating truths, even if it's on their deathbed? Let me know in the comments. Do you believe in karma? Do you think she ever truly paid for what she did? And if you've ever heard a real deathbed confession or experienced something similar, share it below. I read every comment, and your stories could help someone feel less alone. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more chilling true stories, and tap the bell icon so you never miss when the next one drops. Because the next story is just as intense. Thank you.